is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. This is part 2 of our 2-part episode on LGBTQ stories from Japan. It took a little longer to get part 2 recorded and released than I expected. I had a surprise opportunity to travel to New York City and interview author Keiichiro Hirano about the newly released translation of his Akutagawa-winning novel, Eclipse, translated by Brent Deschen and Charles DeWolf. I can't recommend that book strongly enough, and I'm hoping to use that interview for an upcoming episode about Hirano and his work. If you haven't listened to LGBTQ Stories Part 1, I strongly suggest you begin there. If you have listened to Part 1, you already know that we're doing something a little bit different here. I haven't been separating out the sort of history, context of queer Japan from its literature. Instead, I've been telling the story with more of a cultural moment by cultural moment approach, the history and the literature of queer people in Japan. Part 1 covered early Japan, medieval Japan, Edo period Japan, and Meiji Japan. So more or less the beginnings of written Japanese to about 1912. We weren't able to talk about queer women and stories about female-female love, not because there weren't women who loved women earlier in Japanese history. There just wasn't a lot of historical evidence and virtually no stories about those kinds of relationships. Part 2 will cover Taisho Japan, Japan after the Pacific War, and then Japan in the near past and the important story of one contemporary writer. A repeat of our caveat from Part 1 before we begin. I do realize that the label LGBTQ stories from Japan is far from perfect. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer are all terms that have a particular meaning in English-speaking countries in 2024. And it's a meaning that has changed dramatically in some instances, even within English-speaking countries, and even within the last few decades. These terms don't all have the same definitions in Japan, even in 2024. And of course, some of the people we'll discuss today lived and died before the LGBTQ identity even existed in the way it does today in Japan or elsewhere. Finally, a quick episode warning. This episode series is rated mature, not because I think kids can't talk about queerness. It's rated mature because some of these texts are fairly explicit, and today we'll spend some time talking about anti-queer harassment and an author's suicidal ideation. This episode series does have a few content warnings: homophobia, mentions of suicide, fictional and historical, rape, and historical accounts of practices today recognized as pedophilia or pederasty. We ended Part 1 with the death of the Meiji Emperor and the end of the Meiji era in 1912. The Taisho Emperor Yoshihito took the throne after his father's death. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the history of the Taisho era. You can learn more about it in our Season 1 episode, Japanese Journals and Akutagawa's Vision of Hell. The Taisho era is the moment we finally get to talk about women who love women. Girls' love emerged with the growth of girls' schools and the culture that surrounded them. You might recall that one of the most important and long-lasting changes of the Meiji Restoration was the introduction of mandatory education for both boys and girls. By 1905, 98% of school-aged boys and 93% of school-aged girls were attending elementary school. Now, the establishment of education for girls was a good thing. But we shouldn't forget that the ultimate goal of girls' schools was to turn the girls into good wives for their productive, probably middle-class husbands, and wise mothers to raise new, productive, probably middle-class sons. It's a doctrine known as Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. If you're interested in the development of Ryosai Kenbo and how it affected the first generation of women educated under that cultural movement, check out Read Japanese Literature's Season 1 episode, The Women Writers of Meiji Japan. Anyway, after elementary school, further education wasn't an option for most children, especially women. But about 10% of Japanese young people, more boys than girls, but including many girls, went on to middle schools. Many graduates of these so-called normal schools became teachers. Only the truly elite young women continued to higher schools, usually elite by wealth, but sometimes elite by academic talent. Japan's first university for women was established in 1901. Higher school and college students usually boarded away from home. As Sarah Frederick at Boston University points out, time at higher school or university was a time when girls were, for maybe the only time in their lives, supervised by neither father nor husband. It is at these elite, all-female schools that the first recognized culture of female-female love in Japan was born. Michiko Suzuki is a professor at the University of California, Davis. In her important work of scholarship, Becoming Modern Women, she outlines the way female-female love became a socially acceptable and almost expected part of a girl's development into womanhood, especially in these school environments. Let me explain. According to Suzuki, a girl, quote, would first experience innocent same-sex romance. Then, as she matured, she would move on to real heterosexual love to be consummated in a love-based marriage. Finally, she would become a mother and attain maternal love, the highest love of all. This trajectory is very much a reimagining of Ryosai Kenbo for the 1910s and 20s. The addition of an innocent same-sex romance at school was new, but again, a first love, even a first same-sex love, was just training for a proper heterosexual marriage. The idea that the marriage in which a wife would become a good wife and wise mother could be for love was new too, and something of a step forward. Otherwise, there's not much new here for women. So what did female-female love in Taisho Japan look like? In the public imagination, in stories, female-female love took place in the world of the jogakusei, the schoolgirl. The genre of girls' fiction, or stories written specifically for girls, started in the late 1800s as didactic, or teaching stories. You've probably encountered these stories when you were a kid, or if you're a parent in picking out books for your children. They're overly moral stories, stories that are only intended to teach a lesson. They're usually pretty boring. In late Meiji and early Taisho Japan, these stories intentionally reinforced Ryosai Kenbo, that a woman's purpose was to be a good wife and wise mother. These stories often appeared in new magazines targeted specifically at schoolgirls, magazines like Girls Graphic. It's fascinating to me that some of the stories were written and submitted to the journals by the readers themselves. In some issues, reader contributions made up between 10 and 30% of the content. The stories depicted strong bonds between classmates and friends. And it didn't take that long for classmates and friends in the stories, and real life, to begin developing crushes and romantic feelings for each other. These romantic relationships and the stories about them were also sometimes referred to as essu, for the English letter S. No one is quite sure what S or essu stands for, but it could be the English word sister, the English word sex, the Japanese word shoujo, meaning young woman, or all three at the same time. The endings of S stories weren't always happy, in fiction or in real life. I've mentioned several times that S relationships were socially acceptable only as long as they ended when the girls graduated. One of the first major events to draw attention to the existence of these romantic friendships was the love suicide of two girls' higher school graduates in 1911. The girls knew societal and family pressure made their relationship impossible now that they were adults. Some of the most beautiful fictional stories about girls' romantic friendships are written with a haunting awareness that they can't last. Nobuko Yoshiya was one of the most famous authors of girls' stories. Her stories helped turn female-female love into a fundamental aspect of Japanese girlhood. In 1923, she wrote an essay called Dosei o Aisuru Sawai. There's that word from part 1, dosei, same sex. The title translates as something like the happiness of loving one of the same sex. In the essay, she clearly limits her discussion to these schoolgirl stories, which, again, were more or less socially acceptable. But listen to how beautifully she argues in their favor, in Michiko Suzuki's translation. At this time, the girl experiences an extremely close romantic friendship during her school days. And this develops into a huge force. What a pure and dear episode this is in a girl's life. Love must be treated as the most important, serious, profound act in life. No matter what, one must allow burgeoning love to be brought to its full growth. Nobuko Yoshiya's biography is fascinating. She was born in 1896, lived until 1973. She was one of the first Japanese women to own and drive a car. She was the first Japanese woman to own a racehorse. She could afford these things because by the late 1930s, her writing career had made her one of the wealthiest people in Japan. Her annual income was several times the annual income of Japan's ministers of state. And while she wasn't out in the modern sense, she also more or less publicly lived with a female math teacher, Chio Monma, for almost 50 years. Like many other writers of her generation, her legacy is complicated by her complicity with Japan's wartime regime in the late 1930s and 40s. In particular, she served in the Penbutai Propaganda Corps. It seems likely she cooperated with the government, at least in part, because she hoped to be in a position to advocate for greater rights for women who loved women. And you can learn more about the constraints facing World War II-era writers with the Season 1 episode, Japanese Literature in World War II. Yoshiya wrote for most of her life, for both girls and adults, but today she is probably best known, certainly in English, for her flower tales. Yoshiya began serializing the 52 short stories for girls that make up Flower Tales when she was 20. Yellow Rose is the only Yoshiya story that's readily available in English, translated by Sarah Frederick. In the story, Misao Katsuragi has just graduated from a girls' higher school. In the old-fashioned thinking of her uncle and aunt, the narrator explains, when she graduated, she was supposed to make one thing a reality: marriage. But Misao does not want to get married, so she has accepted a post to teach English in an unnamed rural town. One of Misao's fellow passengers on the train from Tokyo is a beautiful young woman carrying an armful of the titular yellow roses. Misao soon discovers the young woman is one of her students, Reiko Urakami. Let me pause here for just a moment to point out that even though Misao is Reiko's teacher, they're both young and very close to the same age. While many English speakers have firmly fixed and entirely appropriate ideas about student-teacher relationships in our time and culture, I do ask you to take a step back and consider that this particular relationship was not considered inappropriate in Japan at the time. Later, Misao helps chaperone a field trip, and then Reiko accidentally gets a bit of soot from the train in her eye. The two begin to interact directly and fall in love. The two begin to plan a future together until Reiko's mother approaches Misao during a visiting day. Reiko's mother wants a favor. Can Misao please use her influence over Reiko to convince her to agree to an arranged marriage? So it is, the narrator tells us, that the sadness of those who love their own sex and therefore cannot live their lives in the form of a conventional marriage is redoubled by the chagrin of parents, for whom marriage represents the sole pinnacle of womanly achievement and the opprobrium and scorn of everyone else. In other words, parents and society are the obstacles to the happiness of women who love women. Misao does as Reiko's mother asks and talks Reiko into the marriage. Then Misao leaves Japan to study abroad. I won't spoil the ending of the story, but you can already sense that there is no happy ending for these women who love each other, or for a woman like Misao who refuses to live the way society wants her to. It's lucky that we know from Yoshio's own life that some women like Misao could find ways to live both happily and authentically. The references to female-female sexuality in Yellow Rose are barely coded at all. The way Misao describes Reiko is fairly erotic. Well-rounded face, black hair, alert eyes, plump and full lips, now appearing bashfully in front of her teacher. She later notices Reiko's nicely shaped ankles. The longest interaction the audience gets to see between the women is a beachside discussion of the Greek poet Sappho. In case you're unfamiliar with Sappho, she was born around 630 BCE on the Greek island of Lesbos. Today, there's still debate about whether Sappho was a lesbian or whether that's even a question worth asking. But the consensus is generally that her poetry does describe erotic feelings about other women. And from a historic standpoint, Sappho has been a symbol of love between women in the European world for centuries. The English words sapphic and lesbian both derive from Sappho and her biography. In Yellow Rose, Misao and Reiko stand romantically on the shore. Misao describes Sappho as the Greek woman poet, a brilliant poet, one with a soul of immense beauty. We should show so much more appreciation and love for this woman poet. And in case matters aren't clear enough, the two kiss when Misao takes a break from her explanation. After her relationship with Reiko collapses, Misao decides to study abroad in Boston, a city famous for its Boston marriages. A Boston marriage is a relationship between two women who set up house together. Yoshiya attempted to write novels about female-female love between adult women, but they were never as well received as her flower tales. Society was never as accepting of stories that went against its expectations for normal romantic relationships or normal sexual development. She stopped writing these stories altogether a year before she and her partner moved in together. Boys' schools were also associated with same-sex sexuality during the Meiji and Taisho periods. We've already discussed a decades-long tradition of dominant older boys taking submissive younger boys as lovers, sometimes resulting in harassment, sexual assault, or rape. If you've listened to part 1, you heard one example of an unwanted older suitor in Ogai Mori's probably autobiographical Vita Sexualis. In his memoirs, Junichiro Tanizaki, one of Japan's most important modern writers, wrote that he was afraid he would be abducted from the sento, the bathhouse, by, quote, young delinquents who liked to pursue still younger boys. Newspapers reported on the phenomenon, even putting forward the plausible claim that adolescent boys cannot go out at night for fear of being abducted. Again, this phenomenon was not at all unique to Japan. If you read accounts of early 20th century English boarding schools, for example, they come up shockingly often. It will likely surprise no one to know that even sexual assault was usually brushed off as the playful antics of boys who will be boys, in Japan, England, and elsewhere. As the Meiji period turned into the Taisho, schools saw the development of more outwardly loving and egalitarian relationships between schoolboys. Stories about friendship between older male students who valiantly protected younger ones began to pop up in magazines targeted at schoolboys. This new egalitarian model of male-male love wasn't unrelated to the kinds of cultural changes that produced S stories. A kind of revolution of emotion during the late Meiji and Taisho periods led to women and men thinking more about love as purer and more spiritual than mere eroticism and physical relationships. These new male-male relationships centered the Bishonen. The Bishonen, literally beautiful youth, where the word youth almost always implies male youth, is an androgynously beautiful young man. In school, Bishonen might have egalitarian relationships with each other, neither one dominating the other. Later, adult men might idolize or even worship Bishonen, often platonically or aesthetically. In fact, one author interested in Bishonen chastised another for eroticizing Bishonen in his work. To focus on physical acts was to soil a pure and beautiful form of love. Many of the men who produced stories about male-male love in the 1920s and 30s, the kinds of stories we're going to turn to in just a minute, were part of Bishonen relationships as schoolboys. By the mid-1920s, Japan had developed an entire industry of journals devoted to sexuality, and a dozen or so that focused specifically on perverse sexuality. The Japanese word here for perverse is hentai. Many anime and manga fans will be familiar with the word hentai and what it implies today. While these magazines kind of looked like they were being printed for people with professional or intellectual interests in perverse sexuality, they became popular reading material for an increasingly literate public with voyeuristic interests. Before the Taisho era ended in 1926, it saw the first of several hentai booms in Japan over the next 50 or so years. Another occurred in the wake of World War II, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. If you've listened to Read Japanese Literature's episode about Japanese crime and mystery writing, you might remember that this is the same time that Hinkaku mystery stories were becoming popular. Hinkaku, different, innovative, strange, uses the same kanji as hentai. Hinkaku mysteries and an interest in perverse sexuality are part of the same cultural interest in the weird. And in fact, Hinkaku mysteries sometimes appeared in the same kinds of publications and were often linked to eru guru nansensu, from the English words erotic, grotesque, nonsense. Eru guru nansensu became a highly popular cultural niche. Dosei, same-sex love, fell under the label perverse sexuality, but so did a host of other sexual practices, from phallic worship to fetishism, from flagellation to fellatio, and of course, BDSM. It's likely no other author is more associated with both male-male love and eruguro nansensu than Edogawa Ranpo. We've talked about Edogawa Ranpo very recently. He's widely considered the father of the Japanese mystery story, and we covered him in our episode, Japanese Crime and Mystery Writing. Edogawa Ranpo is, unsurprisingly, a pen name. The author's real name was Taro Hirai. In case you didn't listen to that episode and didn't make the connection, he took his pen name from the Japanese pronunciation of American author Edgar Allan Poe's name. Read Japanese literature normally uses English language name order for authors. It makes it easier to track down those books at English language bookstores and libraries. Edogawa Ranpo is a common exception because you ruin his pen name if you switch things up. Edogawa is the surname. Edogawa Ranpo lived from 1894 to 1965, and he wasn't just a mystery writer. In 1953, he wrote that the two major preoccupations of his life had been writing detective fiction and locating books, quote, having to do with amorous and erotic desire between men. That quote is from Western Michigan University professor Jeffrey Angles's Writing the Love of Boys, Origins of Bishonen Culture in Modernist Japanese Literature. That's an important English language work on male-male love in Japan during the 1920s and 30s. Edogawa was especially keen to look for these books during the 1920s and 30s because he thought he was the only person interested in male-male love and sexuality. By 1933, he had managed to track down a group of men with similar research interests. Just to be clear, there isn't enough evidence to make a decisive claim about Edogawa's sexuality, in modern terms or even using the vocabulary of his own day. We know he had relationships with both men and women. He married in 1919. The couple had one child and remained on friendly terms, but don't seem to have been very romantically attached. We know that as a schoolboy, Edogawa formed a romantic attachment with another bishonen. When he was in his early 30s, Edogawa wrote that his schoolboy romance was his only experience of true love. Edogawa often incorporated his interest in male-male love into his mysteries, although, according to Jeffrey Angles, his The Demon of the Lonely Isle is the only long novel he wrote that deals extensively with male-male love. Edogawa's friend, mystery writer Seishi Yokomitsu, wrote the advertising blurb for The Demon of the Lonely Isle, and that blurb mentions that, quote, the love for the same sex, which had been a long-standing desire of the author, had finally been incorporated into the novel. The Demon of the Lonely Isle has been translated into English by Alexis J. Brown. Nevertheless, in The Demon of the Lonely Isle, it's clear how ambivalent society's attitudes, and maybe even Edogawa's attitude, about male-male love really were. Sometimes male-male love in the novel is clearly deviant. Other times it's closer to what Jeffrey Angles describes as homosocial brotherhood. In other words, not clearly romantic or sexual at all. It's also clear that Edogawa didn't always enjoy his association with eruguru nansensu. He recognized that some readers' interest was sincere, but he said that the sensationalized use of the erotic left, quote, an extremely bad feeling because, quote, the meaning has become extremely superficial. Ultimately, Edogawa Ranpo's work is important not just for its own sake. He was also a major factor in creating an informal network of male writers interested in men. Angles goes so far as to suggest he's something of Japan's first 20th century focal point of a queer literary subculture. Detective novelist Shiro Hamao, writer Taruho Inagaki, and researcher Junichi Iwata, whose work we mentioned a good deal during Part 1, were among the members of Edogawa's informal clique. The outbreak of full-out war with China in 1937 brought an end to erotic, grotesque nonsense. Japan's censorship campaign included publications of a sexual or frivolous nature, and there was very little writing about male-male or female-female love through the end of World War II. There was another brief hentai boom after the end of the Pacific War. In part, it was because American occupation authorities didn't censor unwholesome literature, often to the chagrin of the Japanese government. Maybe the most extravagant examples of unwholesome literature under the occupation were what were called katsutori zashi. Zashi means magazines, and katsutori means dregs. The term actually comes from a kind of cheap wine brewed from the dregs of the sake-making process. Katsutori zashi were more or less pure smut, porn, crime, exposés, and stories about perverse sexualities, including same-sex love. The hentai boom didn't just produce smut. It also influenced the kinds of high literature or literary fiction that was being written at the time. And almost certainly the great literary work about same-sex love in the post-war period was Yukio Mishima's Confessions of a Mask. Mishima, born Kimitake Hiraoka, was probably the most famous Japanese man interested in male-male sexuality in the post-war era. We covered his biography at length in part 2 of the season 3 episode, Misogyny and Yukio Mishima. Mishima was born in 1925 and famously committed ritual suicide in 1970. Confessions of a Mask is something like a semi-autobiographical novel. It's complicated. Mishima later implied he didn't sleep with men. His wife insisted he never slept with men. There's pretty clear historical evidence Mishima did sleep with men. The details of Confessions of a Mask match so closely with Mishima's early life that many critics, including me, feel fairly safe taking it, not at face value, but as a valuable source about Mishima's sexuality as a child, teen, and young man. For what it's worth, Mishima is supposed to have boasted that Confessions of a Mask was the first important Japanese homosexual narrative since Saikaku's The Great Mirror of Male Love, which we discussed in part 1. The narrator of Confessions of a Mask, the Mishima stand-in, maybe, is named Kuniko Mitani. Kuniko was a very young man when he realized he was attracted to other boys and eventually men. His first experience masturbating was when he saw a picture of a painting of Saint Sebastian by Guido Reni. In case you need more evidence that Confessions is indeed partially autobiographical, check out the episode artwork. You'll see a picture of Yukio Mishima posing as Saint Sebastian from the artwork of Guido Reni later in his life. Confessions goes on to describe Kuniko's kind of homosexual awakening and the sorts of boys and young men Kuniko, also probably Mishima, desired, especially a delinquent classmate named Omi with a strong, maturing body and abundant body hair. Because Omi was Kuniko's first love, Kuniko can no longer love an intellectual person. He says he begins to love strength, an impression of overflowing blood, ignorance, rough gestures, careless speech, and the savage melancholy inherent in flesh not tainted in any way with intellect. So this is no egalitarian bishonen love affair. Kuniko describes himself as something like a bishonen, but he is not lusting after beautiful boys. Kuniko's lust for hairy, manly men instead of beautiful bishonen is part of a generational cultural change in the most popular set of desires for gay men in Japan, That's probably outside of our scope today, but interesting to note. As a teen, Kuniko courts the sister of a friend, so did Mishima. Kuniko is drawn to the young woman's beauty and purity. He may even legitimately fall emotionally in love with her, but he can't ultimately summon any sexual desire for her whatsoever. It's probably also worth noting that Mishima's homosexuality is pretty clearly tied to his misogynistic attitudes about women. Kuniko Mitani's first object of admiration is a picture of a knight on a white horse. He is absolutely horrified when he discovers the knight is actually a woman, Joan of Arc. It left Kuniko with a, quote, repugnance deep-rooted and hard to explain toward women in male attire. And he calls the episode an example of revenge by reality. Mishima's gayest novel, so to speak, is a novel called Forbidden Colors. It's about a respected post-war author who meets a gorgeous young man at one of Japan's exclusive spa resorts. The young man is gay, but engaged to a rich and extremely conventional young woman. The author decides to shape the young man into a weapon to wreak his revenge against the entire female sex as a whole, and the author succeeds. Some critics consider Forbidden Colors semi-autobiographical too, with Mishima playing the role of the author. Some of Mishima's other writing touches on male-male sexuality as well. According to Donald Keene, Mishima told his friends that some of his female heroines, especially the lusty ones, were really men. If you're a Mishima reader, the women of note are Etsuko from Thirst for Love and Kazu from After the Banquet. Mishima is now credited with authorship of work published in gay interest magazines and published under pseudonyms. And actually, the third book in the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, The Temple of Dawn, deals with female-female sexuality. After Mishima, there are very few prose stories of same-sex love available in English translation. Why? The answer lies a little in Japan and a lot in English-speaking culture. Japan's queer culture evolved rapidly after World War II. It's fascinating, and I'd love to cover it in greater depth, but it really is outside of the scope of our episode today if we're trying to focus on literature. I've already tried to cram as much information as I can into this episode. If you're interested in learning more about the subject, I highly recommend Professor Mark McClelland's Queer Japan from the Pacific War to the Internet Age. Professor McClelland works at Australia's University of Wollongong. Of particular note are the different and ever-changing categories of men who love men, especially in post-war Japan, from the cross-dressing dansho to the feminine gay boy to the masculine-identified homo. Nevertheless, there was still a lot of stigma about being a person who loved members of their own sex in Japan, especially before the 1990s. Much of the writing about same-sex love happened in the perverse press, and then later magazines targeted specifically at men who loved men, some of it written anonymously or by amateurs. Adonis was a notable magazine targeting intellectuals, including Yukio Mishima, who seems to have written at least one piece for them. Barazoku, or Rose Tribe, was launched in 1971. It was the first commercial magazine targeting masculine-oriented homosexual men in Japan. Notably, magazines about male-male love attracted attention from female readers too. Sometimes these women were erotically attracted to gay men, or romantically attracted to gay men. Sometimes they were exploring their own sexuality, and sometimes they were lesbians who wished there were a similar publication for them too. In his introduction to Partings at Dawn, Paul Gordon Shallow mentions a distinctly gay male literature that has come into being in recent years. Recent years in this context means the early and mid-1990s. The phenomenon Shallow notes has since come to be called the gay boom, or gay boom. Even today, some of Japan's gay authors and mangaka publish under pseudonyms and aren't publicly out. I know of several translated novels by and about lesbians, but I honestly don't know how many novels there are in Japan by and about LGBTQ people, especially by and about gay men. I'd love to be informed so I can share this information. So the number of LGBTQ stories in Japan, especially from the 70s and 80s, is somewhat limited, but not as limited in Japanese as it is in English. There is virtually no prose about queer people from Japan from the 1970s and 80s translated into English. And there is virtually no prose by men who love men translated into English that dates from after the work of Mishima. The anthologies we've already mentioned, Partings at Dawn and Queer Subjects in Modern Japanese Literature, are, of course, the major exceptions. There are also a few poetry collections, including work by Tatsuhiko Ishii and Matsuo Takahashi, two of Japan's most highly regarded gay poets. It's likely, and this is just an educated guess, that English speakers' hang-ups about gay men, or the hang-ups publishers think English speakers still have about gay men, have prevented publishers from putting out translations of these works. I would probably be remiss if I didn't at least mention the role played by manga in sharing the stories of the LGBTQ community in Japan. Those same perverse press magazines, or magazines aimed at men who love men, also featured comics about same-sex love and same-sex sexuality. Famous erotic mangaka Go Mishima was an important early contributor to Barazoku. Later, Gengoro Tagame made his name in Barazoku. Today, Tagame is regarded as perhaps the person most directly responsible for the success of gay manga. He's also the co-founder of G-Men, a magazine that has served as an incubator for up-and-coming gay mangaka. Tagame is heavily associated with erotica, but if you're interested in Tagame but not erotica, you can check out his My Brother's Husband, translated by Anne Ishii. By the way, if you're a fan of erotic gay manga, you should know that the term bara, as in barazoku, is very outdated as a way to talk about gay men in Japan. Tagame, in particular, notes that the preferred terms among gay men in Japan today are gay and homo. Bara is more or less equivalent to the English language pansy, which is not only somewhat unflattering and a little bit of an insult, but also just really dated. As for women's comics, manga aimed at young girls is called shoujo, literally just young woman, manga. And shoujo stories included the kinds of S relationships we talked about earlier, starting in the 1910s and 1920s. By the 1950s, male mangaka Osamu Tezuka was illustrating a shoujo manga called Princess Knight about a princess who must pretend to be a boy because she was born with both a boy's soul and a girl's soul. Especially following Princess Knight, a lot of shoujo stories featured protagonists who defied gender norms. Shortly after the first Japanese Uemin Ribu demonstration in Japan in October 1970, Keiko Takamiya debuted a manga now regarded as the first work of shonen ai, a shoujo subgenre better known today as boys' love, or BL. Boys' love is remarkable because historically it turns out to be more important to the development of queer women's manga than stories about women who love women, although that's begun to change. According to Kanagawa University professor James Welker, quote, "The professional artists who developed shonen ai and other commercial queer shoujo manga saw themselves as, in a sense, intervening through the genre in readers' lives, liberating shoujo readers from cultural restrictions that positioned females as passive players in the heteronormative romance script, as well as innocent and uninterested in sexuality. Many girls who later came to identify as lesbian or otherwise queer grew up reading BL manga. Of course, manga isn't Read Japanese Literature's signature strength, and so I'm going to stop here. But if this is a topic you're interested in, I have 3 books to recommend in ascending order of academicness. The first is Massive Gay Erotic Manga and the Men Who Make It by Chip Kidd, Graham Colbains, and Anne Ishii. Let me just be clear that the comics that appear here are very explicit. Avoid if that's a problem. Otherwise, this is a great reference. 2, By Your Side, The First 100 Years of Yuri Anime and Manga by Erica Friedman. Friedman's book also contains more about Nobuko Yoshiya. And 3, Transfiguring Women in Late 20th Century Japan, Feminists, Lesbians, and Girls Comics Artists and Fans by James Welker. You should also check out the podcast Manga-splaining, especially their episodes about Gengoro Tagame. And there are links to all of these resources on the website. There is so much more I wanted to talk about here. I wanted to talk about Reiko Matsuura. She was one of the most established out lesbian writers of the 1980s and 1990s. She didn't want to be labeled as a lesbian or homosexual writer. I wanted to talk about her novel, The Apprenticeship of Big Toe P, translated by Michael Emmerich, about a woman who wakes up one morning to find the big toe of her right foot transformed into a penis, leading to a big queer awakening. I wanted to talk about Ao Omais, People Who Talk to Stuffed Animals Are Nice, a very recent novel translated by Emily Balistrieri that explores gender in some really nuanced ways. Maybe this should have been a 3-part episode. But the final story I'm going to talk about today is a very contemporary one, so contemporary, in fact, that I'm grateful this episode got a little bit delayed. The news only broke on November 20th, 2024. I was already planning to talk about Akutagawa-winning author Li Kotomi because she has been openly lesbian her entire writing career. By the way, Li Kotomi is another author writing in Japanese where we say her family name first. She is Taiwanese by birth. When we talk about an ethnically Chinese author, we still use the surname first. Solo Dance, translated by author Reggie Morris, is Li's only novel currently available in English. It's about a Taiwanese-born Japanese lesbian like Li. But on November 20th, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, Li reluctantly issued a public statement outing herself as trans. The statement was reluctant because Li had wanted to keep her transgender status private. Now, keep in mind that Japan protects its authors' privacy far more than English-speaking countries do. There are authors who write under pen names and live and die without their real names ever becoming public knowledge. Li has spent years being outed against her will, harassed and doxxed online by anti-trans accounts from Taiwan. Again, Taiwan is her country of origin. In case you're unfamiliar with the term, to dox someone means to publish their private identifying information online, almost always because you want other people to harass them too. Li also organized a statement by authors in Japan opposing LGBTQ discrimination. It was signed by 51 other Japanese novelists and released earlier in the day than Li's own personal statement. Signatories included some authors we've covered on Read Japanese Literature, like mystery and thriller writer Natsuo Kirino, and the author that writes such eloquent nuclear fiction, Erika Kobayashi. Signatories also included Shia Fujino, who is also transgender. Li and Fujino are now the only 2 openly trans Akutagawa winners. Li was born in Taiwan in 1989. She started studying Japanese around 2004 when she was 15. She moved to Japan in 2013, shortly after finishing her undergraduate degree. She also holds a master's in Japanese literature from Waseda, one of Japan's most prestigious universities. She published her first novel, Solo Dance, in 2017, and she won the Akutagawa Prize for The Island Where the Spider Lilies Bloom in 2021. That one hasn't been translated into English to date, although I've heard whispers a translation is expected, fingers crossed. In 2023, Li was a resident at the world-renowned Iowa Writers Program. She told an interviewer there, "I'm a lesbian. Most of my stories are featuring LGBTQ experiences in Japan and Taiwan, which is a field that I believe there are still many things that must be written. At least for now, the identity of being a member of the queer community is very important to me. It influences the way I live, the way I think, the way I love, the way I see this world, and probably the way I die." When I reviewed Li's Solo Dance for the Asian Review of Books in 2022, I noted that it's a novel about identity. The protagonist, Yingmei Zhao, is in the 4th grade when she develops her first crush on another girl. When sexual assault shatters her sense of security and self, she decides to start over in Japan. Even though Japan is what the protagonist calls a queer desert, she has fallen in love with the country through the literature of Osamu Dazai and Haruki Murakami. In Japan, Yingmei Zhao becomes the Japanized Norie Cho. When she introduces herself to her coworkers, she says, "Hello everyone, my name is Cho Norie. I'm from Taiwan, and sorry to ruin your stereotypes, but I hate bubble tea and pineapple cake." Then the narrator adds, of course she refrains from talking about her being a lesbian, about the incident, about her mental illness, about how she had come to Japan in order to escape from Taiwan, about how Norie was a name she'd made up to sound more Japanese. Solo Dance is not a novel for the faint of heart. Death is the novel's most prominent motif. The word death even opens the novel. At the risk of spoilers, I will say that the protagonist spends a lot of time thinking about suicide. Honestly, Li's realistic, unglamorous portrayal of suicidal ideation makes more sense after her recent revelations about herself. In her statement, she relayed how celebrity suicides in Japan helped draw attention and much-needed action toward online bullying in Japan. She responded by thinking, is it because Taiwan has not had a celebrity suicide due to being outed or bullied online that Taiwan's judicial system fails to take the harm of these actions seriously? Shall I be the first case? Norie finds her only real relief through literature, both as a reader and a writer. Always a fascinating feature in a novel for me. Overall, Solo Dance is a great book and an important part of the canon of LGBTQ literature from Japan. Again, the real news here isn't that Li is trans, but that Li has been bullied into revealing something about herself she didn't wish to reveal. So, why should we read LGBTQ stories from Japan? As usual, I'll start with the most obvious answer. We should read LGBTQ stories from Japan because these are just good stories. And because they represent such a variety of genres over such a stretch of time, you could more or less do an entire survey course of Japanese literature only covering LGBTQ stories and still have a fair summary of the history of Japanese literature. Second of all, the story of queer Japan is so very different from the story of the queer English-speaking world. By reading Saikaku or Yoshiya or Mishima or Li, you'll get a dramatically richer understanding of the variety of queer experiences across global history. And that's a good reason to explore queer stories from other countries and times as well. Finally, to once again adapt one of my favorite quotes from translator Alison Markin Powell. By reading any marginalized group in translation, by buying or borrowing books, but also by talking about them in any medium. Readers demonstrate that there is a demand for the subjects that they choose to write about and the perspectives that they offer, that it makes a difference who tells the story and why they tell it. The more we read and talk about LGBTQ stories from Japan, the more likely we are to see them in translation. It would be great to see LGBTQ authors better represented in English, especially contemporary prose fiction by gay men, which we are almost entirely lacking. We haven't focused on one single text today, but you can look at the episode page for all the works we've talked about in our 2-part series. There's also a comprehensive bibliography of the scholarship I've been able to make use of for this episode. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for making my university library membership possible and for paying for the purchase of secondary sources. You can join them for as little as $3 a month by visiting patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Remember that they get an early release and bonus content with every episode. In this episode in particular, the bonus content covers an entire extra book. Please don't join Read Japanese Literature or any new Patreon through the iPhone app. The App Store implemented a surcharge, so the organizations you want to support won't be getting much of your donation. To join, just visit patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. You can also support Read Japanese Literature by checking out our holiday gift guide, now available through the website. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. We're now on Facebook. Search for Read Japanese Literature or follow the link on the website contact page. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon. We're on YouTube /ReadJapaneseLiterature, Blue Sky @readjapaneselit.bsky.social, Instagram also @ReadJapaneseLit. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for pointing me in the direction of Class S stories and the book Becoming Modern Japanese Women. Thank you to the Goodreads Japanese literature community for comparing resources and helping me track down LGBTQ stories from Japan. And thank you as always to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.